The rifle hit the cobblestones before anyone could blink. The sound was sharp and clean, like a single handclap in an empty church. It cut straight through the low murmur of the crowd, through the distant notes of the brass band, through the rustle of flags and the clicking of cameras. In an instant, every sound on that street went quiet. Thousands of people standing along the royal procession route turned their heads at the same moment, searching for the source of that sound. And then they found it. A young soldier standing at the edge of the royal walkway was swaying on his feet. His white-gloved hands were empty. At his boots, a ceremonial rifle lay flat against the ancient cobblestones of the palace forecourt. His face was pale and damp. His eyes were open, but something behind them had already gone somewhere far away. His name was Lance Corporal William Carr. He was 24 years old, and up until the moment that rifle left his hands, he had been, by every measurable standard, one of the finest ceremonial guards the regiment had produced in nearly a decade. William had grown up in a small town in the north of England, the kind of place where the streets are quiet on Sunday mornings and everyone knows which family lives in which house. His father, Edward Carr, worked long shifts at a paper mill for most of his working life. His mother, Dorothy, cleaned offices before the sun came up so that William and his younger sister, Frances, could have good shoes for school. There was no money for luxuries, but there was always enough, and the house was always warm, and the table was always set at dinner time. William grew up understanding that dignity had nothing to do with wealth. It had to do with showing up. He joined the army at 18, not because someone told him to, and not because he had no other options. He joined because he wanted to be part of something that required the best version of himself. He passed his initial training at the top of his intake. He was noted by his commanding officers in the first year for his precision, his calm under pressure, and his extraordinary ability to remain perfectly still for long periods of time. That last quality, which sounds unremarkable, is actually extraordinarily rare. Most people fidget. Most people shift their weight, blink too often, let their shoulders drift. William could stand like a photograph of a soldier. His posture did not waver. His expression did not move. He was, in the language of the regiment, a natural. It was that quality that earned him the ceremonial posting. Not everyone got one. The regiment was selective about which soldiers stood beside the monarch during public appearances. You had to be fit, composed, trained in the specific footwork and positioning of ceremonial duty, and you had to be the kind of person whose presence communicated steadiness. William was all of those things. When he was told he had been selected, he called his father from a payphone outside the barracks. Edward Carr said very little. William said later that he had heard his father breathing on the other end of the line for a long moment before he spoke. What Edward finally said was simply this: "Your grandfather would have liked to hear that." William's grandfather, George Carr, had served in the British Army during an earlier generation. He had never spoken much about his service, the way that generation often did not. But he had kept his boots polished until the day he died, and he had stood straight at every public occasion he ever attended, and William had watched him do it as a small boy and quietly decided that there was something worth respecting in a man who carried himself that way. George had passed away the winter before William received his ceremonial posting. William had worn his grandfather's old regimental tie to the funeral. He kept it folded in his locker at the barracks, behind everything else. The morning of the procession began the way all such mornings began. 4 o'clock wake-up, cold water, kit inspection, the ritual of the uniform, which took longer than most civilians would imagine. Every piece of the ceremonial dress had a specific order of assembly, a specific standard of presentation. The bearskin cap alone required careful handling. The white gloves had to be rolled on without a single crease. The boots had to reflect light cleanly enough to see your own face in them. William had completed this routine dozens of times. He knew it the way a pianist knows a well-practiced piece, without having to think about each individual motion. What he did not tell anyone that morning was that he had not slept in 3 days. It had started 4 days before the procession, with what he assumed was a brief illness, the kind that visits soldiers in barracks regularly and usually passes in a day. A low-grade fever, a feeling of heaviness behind the eyes. He had drunk water, taken his temperature, decided it was nothing worth mentioning, and gone on. The fever had not left. By the second day it had settled into something that felt more like a slow drain on his entire system, as though all the energy in his body was being quietly drawn out through a hole somewhere he could not find. He ate what he could. He slept in fragments. He said nothing. The culture of the regiment was not unkind, but it was demanding. Soldiers were expected to push through minor discomfort. There was a clear and unspoken understanding that reporting illness close to a major public duty was the kind of thing that reflected poorly on a person's commitment. William had absorbed that understanding, the way he had absorbed everything else about military life, completely, without questioning it. So he said nothing. He dressed in the dark at 4 in the morning and felt the world tilt slightly as he stood, and he waited for it to steady, and when it did not fully steady, he walked out of the barracks door anyway. The morning was warm for August in London. The sky was a pale, clear blue, the kind of sky that looks pleasant in photographs and feels like a furnace when you are standing beneath it in a full ceremonial uniform with no shade and no water. By the time the regiment had moved into position outside the palace, the sun was already high and the temperature was climbing. The forecourt cobblestones were radiating heat upward. The bearskin cap trapped warmth around William's head. He could feel his pulse in his temples, which he knew was not a good sign. He stood straight. He kept his eyes forward. He performed in every visible way, like the soldier he had trained himself to be. The procession began on schedule. The sound of hooves on stone, the slow, measured progress of the royal vehicle along the route. William was positioned close enough to be within the frame of every camera pointed at the monarch. He was, in that moment, exactly where his entire career had been building toward. He was doing his job perfectly. He was also, in ways that no camera could detect, beginning to fail at the most fundamental level. His body temperature had continued rising since he had left the barracks. He had consumed no water since the previous evening. His blood pressure was doing something quiet and dangerous. None of this was visible. He stood straight. He kept his eyes forward. The monarch came level with his position at 11:47 in the morning, and that was when everything happened at once. The heat hit him like a door swinging shut. His vision, which had been narrowing at the edges for the past 20 minutes, without him fully registering it, suddenly contracted. His legs, which had been bearing his weight without complaint for nearly 3 hours, sent him a message that arrived too late to act on. His hands, trained to grip that rifle in exactly the correct position, simply opened. He did not fall. That was the part that struck his commanding officer afterward, when the medical reports were being reviewed. William Carr did not fall. He swayed. He steadied himself against what appeared to be nothing at all, and he remained standing. But the rifle was already on the ground. It had left his hands before he even understood that it had left his hands. The sound of it striking the cobblestones was, by multiple witness accounts, the loudest thing anyone heard that day. The crowd went silent. The procession paused. 3 members of the regiment moved to William's position within seconds. He was conscious and standing when they reached him. He looked at the rifle on the ground. He looked at the faces of the soldiers around him. He said nothing. He was guided away from his position carefully and efficiently, and a replacement guard stepped into his place, and within 90 seconds the procession had continued as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. Everyone present knew it, and within 4 minutes the entire world would know it too. What no one standing in that crowd understood, what no one watching the footage would think to ask, was the question that should have come first. Why did that young man drop his rifle? The answer to that question, when it finally came to light, would change not just William Carr's life, but the lives of every soldier who came after him. In the barracks medical room, 20 minutes after the procession continued without him, a nurse named Catherine placed a thermometer in William's ear and looked at the reading and went very still. She checked it again. She called the duty doctor immediately. William sat on the edge of the examination table with his uniform jacket removed and his collar open and his hands resting flat on his thighs, and he looked at the wall in front of him with the same expression he had maintained on the forecourt: composed, closed, unwilling to let anything through. The doctor arrived, reviewed the reading, and asked William a series of questions in a calm, efficient voice. When did the symptoms start? Had he eaten? Had he consumed any water? Had he reported his condition to a superior? William answered the first 3 questions honestly. On the 4th question, he paused for a moment, and then he said no. Just that, no. The doctor did not react with anger. He simply nodded and continued his assessment. William sat very still while the initial treatment began. Outside the medical room, he could hear the distant sound of the crowd still gathered along the procession route. He could hear the brass band. He could hear the ordinary noise of a ceremonial day continuing without him. He thought about the rifle on the cobblestones. He thought about the sound it had made. He thought about his grandfather's tie folded in his locker. And for the first time since 4 o'clock that morning, he allowed himself to close his eyes. He was 24 years old, and he had spent 3 years building a version of himself that could bear anything without showing the seams. And now, in the quietest and most private way possible, while the world outside was busy deciding who he was, William Carr let the mask come down for just a moment. Not for long, just long enough to breathe. Helen, the nurse who had stayed with him that first afternoon, checked on him one more time before her shift ended. She paused in the doorway and looked at him lying there with his eyes closed and his breathing finally slow and even, and she thought that he looked, for the first time since she had met him 6 hours ago, like a young man who was simply resting rather than one who was bracing himself against something. She turned the light down and pulled the door softly behind her. The corridor outside was quiet. The day had moved on to evening. Somewhere beyond the barracks walls, the city was going about its ordinary business, unaware that the soldier whose name had been running along the bottom of every news channel's screen since midday was lying in a dim room 16 feet from the main corridor, breathing slowly, finally resting. What came next would surprise everyone, including him. The footage appeared online before the procession had even ended. Someone standing 3 rows back in the crowd along the royal route had caught the whole thing on their phone camera. The angle was good, terrible, in fact, for William, because it was good. It showed him clearly the sway, the hands opening, the rifle dropping, the sound that seemed to stop everything. The clip was 11 seconds long. By the time William was sitting in the medical room with a nurse, checking his temperature for the 2nd time, that 11 seconds had already been watched by more people than lived in the city of Manchester. The title someone gave it when they posted it told you everything you needed to know about how the public was going to respond. It read, "Royal Guard disgraces himself in front of the king." Within the hour, that single post had been shared across every major platform. By midday, the number was in the millions. By evening, it had reached 60 million views across multiple uploads and reshares, and the number was still climbing. The comments were immediate and merciless. The internet, which can be a place of extraordinary kindness and also extraordinary cruelty, chose cruelty that day with remarkable efficiency. People who had never held a rifle, who had never stood in full ceremonial dress in August heat for 3 hours, who could not have named a single piece of kit that William wore, had very strong and very certain opinions about what his dropped rifle meant. They called it a disgrace. They called it an embarrassment to the nation. Several accounts with large followings shared the clip and added words that described William in terms that had nothing to do with rifles or ceremonies, and everything to do with the kind of judgment people make when they see a man at his lowest point and choose to kick instead of ask. William's full name was not in the original post. But the internet is patient and resourceful when it wants to be. Within 2 hours, journalists and amateur investigators working in parallel had cross-referenced military public records, photographs from previous ceremonial events, and a photograph that William's sister Frances had once posted of the 2 of them at a regimental open day. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, his name was trending on 2 platforms. By 4 o'clock, there were camera crews parked outside the gates of the barracks. The commanding officer of William's regiment, Colonel Peter Aldgate, was a careful and experienced man who had served for 32 years and had managed situations far more complicated than a press gathering outside a gate. He issued a brief statement confirming that the incident was being reviewed and that the health and welfare of the soldier in question were being assessed. He said nothing more. He had been advised by the regimental communications officer, a sharp young captain named Louise, to keep all public statements short and factual until the full picture was clear. Peter Aldgate was the kind of man who did not need to be told twice. Inside the barracks, the medical team confirmed what the early readings had suggested. William had heat exhaustion with early signs of something more serious developing. His core temperature had been elevated for a significant period. He was dehydrated well beyond what a day's mist water would produce. The doctor on duty, a man named Dr. Philip Grant, reviewed the full picture and told Peter Aldgate privately that William had been operating in a state that most people would have found impossible to function in at all, let alone stand at ceremonial attention during a royal procession. Peter Aldgate read the medical report twice. Then he read it a third time. He sat with it for a long moment in his office with the door closed. Outside, he could hear his staff moving between rooms, taking calls, managing the day. He could hear the faint sound of television through the wall, the rolling news cycle already running the footage on a loop. He put the medical report face down on his desk and looked at the ceiling. William, meanwhile, was moved to a proper care facility within the barracks where he could receive the treatment he needed. The medical staff were professional and direct and kind in the way that medical staff are when they have seen enough to know that the patient in front of them is not just physically unwell. A nurse named Helen sat with him for a while after the immediate treatment was administered. She asked him how he was feeling. He said he was fine. She looked at him steadily and did not respond to that, because they both understood that it was not a truthful answer, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. His phone had been brought to him from his locker. He looked at the notifications on the screen and set it face down on the blanket beside him. He did not look at it again for the rest of that afternoon. What he did instead was stare at the ceiling of the small medical room and think about every decision he had made over the past 4 days, tracing them backward the way you trace a path on a map when you are trying to understand how you ended up somewhere you did not intend to go. He thought about the morning 4 days ago, when he had first felt the fever, and chosen not to report it. He thought about every morning since, the same choice made again, with slightly less justification each time. He thought about the specific moment, 2 hours and 20 minutes into the procession, when his vision had started to narrow at the edges, and he had noticed it, and decided to hold on anyway. He thought about what he had been afraid of. He turned that question over carefully, the way you turn a stone over to see what is underneath, because he was not entirely certain of the answer. What he found, when he looked at it honestly, was this. He had been afraid of being seen as weak, not by the regiment in any abstract sense, not by the commanding officer, not by the public. He had been afraid of being seen as weak by himself. He had constructed, over 3 years of careful and disciplined service, a version of William Carr that did not have limits. That version could stand in the heat. That version could push through illness. That version did not need to sit down. That version did not cause scenes. Admitting that he was unwell would have required him to acknowledge that the version he had built was not real, and that, he understood now, lying in a medical room with an IV line in his arm, was exactly what it had cost him. Outside the barracks walls, the story was growing. Newspaper editors who had gone to bed the previous night with a quiet news day on their hands woke up to the footage and made rapid decisions. By the following morning, William's face was on the front page of 4 national newspapers. The coverage was not kind. 3 of the 4 ran the story as a military discipline question. 1 ran it as a question about the state of the armed forces more broadly, using William as a hook for a longer argument that had nothing to do with William personally. His name was used freely. His service record was described in broad terms. Nobody called the barracks to ask him anything directly. Nobody, in those first 48 hours, seems to have thought to ask the doctor what had actually happened to him. The social media response continued to build. Several celebrities with large platforms shared the clip, some with sympathetic commentary and some without. A retired general appeared on a morning news program and said, with great confidence, that dropping a rifle in front of the Monarch was an unacceptable failure of basic military discipline, and that in his day such a thing would not have occurred. He was not asked whether he had reviewed the medical report. The medical report was not public at that point. Nobody knew there was one. Frances Carr, William's younger sister, watched the news from her flat in Leeds with her flatmate beside her on the sofa. She did not post anything. She picked up her phone and called her brother's number and got no answer, which she understood because she knew her brother, and she knew that if the whole world was looking at him, he would go very quiet and very still, the same way he had done as a child when something overwhelmed him. She called her father instead. Edward Carr had seen the footage by the time Frances called. He had seen it on the television in his sitting room, and then a neighbor had knocked on his door to ask if he had seen it, and he had confirmed that he had, and the neighbor had gone away, and Edward had sat back in his chair and looked at the floor for a long time. He was 61 years old. He had spent his working life at the mill, and he had never, in all those years, taken a sick day that was not absolutely necessary, because his family needed the money, and the money only came if he showed up. He had passed that understanding on to his son without meaning to, the way parents pass on 100 things without meaning to, in the texture of everyday life, in the way they talk about work, in the things they say and the things they do not say. She asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. She said she was coming to visit at the weekend. He said that would be good. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that William had learned his silence from somewhere, and they knew exactly where. 3 days after the incident, the formal review process began. William was notified by his commanding officer that an inquiry into the events of the procession day had been opened, as was standard procedure following any significant incident during a public duty. The notification was delivered in person by Peter Aldgate himself, who sat across from William in a small office inside the medical facility and delivered the information in a clear and measured tone. William listened carefully and then said that he understood. Peter Aldgate looked at him for a moment and then asked, with the same measured tone, how he was doing. Not how the recovery was going, not what the doctors had said, how he was doing. William said that he was doing all right. Peter Aldgate nodded slowly and said that was good to hear. He gathered his papers and stood to leave. At the door he paused. He did not turn around. He said, quietly, that the medical report had been reviewed in full and that it was part of the official record. Then he left. William sat in the quiet room after the door closed and turned those words over in his mind. The medical report had been reviewed in full and it was part of the official record. He was not sure yet what that meant for him. He was not sure yet what any of it meant. But something in the way Peter Aldgate had said it, with that specific pause at the door, told him that the story was not finished yet, that there was a part of it he had not yet seen. Peter Aldgate spent the evening of that day reading through the complete medical documentation for the third and final time. He was not a man given to prolonged deliberation. 32 years of command had given him the ability to assess a situation, make a decision, and move. But this particular evening he sat with the medical report and thought about the system that had produced it. Not the healthcare system, the other one, the invisible one, made of habits and assumptions, and the particular silence that settles in a regiment when something goes unsaid often enough that saying it begins to feel wrong. He thought about every soldier he had commanded over 3 decades. He thought about the number of times he had told recruits, not in those exact words but in every other available way, that endurance was the highest virtue. He thought about how many William Carrs there might have been over the years whom he had never known about because the medical room had never been involved, because the thing had resolved itself or been hidden more successfully, because the rifle had stayed in the hands even when the hands were shaking. He was not a man who blamed himself easily, but he was a fair man, which meant he was willing to look at what was true even when it was uncomfortable. He closed the file. He poured himself a glass of water, which he drank standing at the window of his office, looking out at the parade ground in the fading evening light. The parade ground was empty. The day's duties were done. Somewhere across the barracks, a light was on in the medical wing. He put the glass down. He had 3 things to do. He had already started the first one, the call to the correct channels. He would deal with the second and third tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as it took. He was 61 years old, and he had not always done everything right, but he was not done yet. William, in his room in the medical wing, did not know any of this. He was asleep by 9 o'clock, which was the earliest he had slept in well over a week. He slept without dreaming, which was the particular mercy of a body that had finally been allowed to stop performing. His father called the barracks the following morning and was told, politely and with very little information, that William was receiving appropriate care and was not available to take calls at that time. Edward Carr said that he understood, thanked the person on the other end of the line, and hung up. He sat in his kitchen in the north of England and drank his tea and looked at the wall. The television was off. He had turned it off after the second time the clip ran on the evening news. He was a practical man who understood that watching something he could not change was not the same as dealing with it. He put his coat on and went for a walk, which was what he did when he needed to think. He walked for a long time. When he got home, he made dinner and ate it, and washed up the dishes and went to bed early. He did not sleep easily, but he lay there quietly in the dark, the way he had always lain quietly through difficult nights, and he waited for morning. He was right, but not in any way he could have predicted. The 60 million view clip had been edited by the time most people saw it. Not deliberately, not by any single person with an agenda, but in the way that all viral moments get edited by the mechanics of how they spread. The full clip, as captured by the person who had been standing 3 rows back, ran for 31 seconds. It showed William swaying, it showed the rifle dropping, it showed the regiment responding, and it showed, at the very end, a brief sequence where William was guided away. In that last sequence, if you watched it carefully, you could see that he was not stumbling or being restrained. He was being supported. There is a difference. But by the time the clip had been re-uploaded, screen-recorded, embedded in news segments and shared with commentary, most versions ran for 11 seconds. The 11 seconds that showed the rifle dropping. The rest was cut away. The world made its decision based on 11 seconds of a 31-second event, which was, in itself, a 31-second window into a day that had lasted nearly 3 hours, inside a career that had lasted 3 years, inside a life that had lasted 24 years. The mathematics of viral outrage are always this way. The smaller the sample, the louder the certainty. This is not an unusual story. It happens to people in all kinds of situations, in every kind of profession, in every corner of public and semi-public life. A moment becomes a clip becomes a verdict becomes a fact that no correction will ever fully reach. But what made William's situation unusual, what separated it from the ordinary cruelty of a news cycle, was what was happening simultaneously in a much quieter room than the ones the cameras were pointed at. Dr. Philip Grant had submitted his full medical assessment to the regimental medical officer the morning after the incident. The report was thorough and specific. It documented William's core temperature at the time of initial examination. It documented the degree of dehydration. It detailed the progression of symptoms consistent with severe heat exhaustion and noted the clinical opinion that the soldier had been operating in a compromised physiological state for a minimum of 48 hours prior to the incident. It used careful, clinical language, the kind of language that doctors use to describe facts precisely and without drama. But the facts it described, when read by someone who understood what they meant, were striking. Peter Aldgate had read it 3 times. He had shown it to the regimental medical officer, Major Sandra Goff, who had reviewed it independently and confirmed the assessment. He had placed it in the formal record of the inquiry. And then, because Peter Aldgate was a man who had spent 32 years understanding the difference between what an institution is required to do and what a good person does, he had made a private call. The call went through official channels, as all such communications must. It was routed correctly, documented appropriately, and handled with the care that contact between a regimental commanding officer and the royal household always requires. Peter Aldgate did not ask for anything in that call. He did not advocate, he did not argue, he simply made it known that new information had come to light regarding the health status of the soldier involved in the procession incident, and that this information had been formally documented and was available for review. He did not know what would happen next. He had done what he believed was right, and he was prepared to accept whatever followed. What followed arrived on the morning of the 5th day after the incident. It arrived as a brief message, delivered through the correct channels, from the private secretary of the royal household. The message requested a meeting, not a formal review, not an official inquiry session, a meeting, a private one, with no press attendance and no public announcement, at a time and location to be confirmed. The meeting was requested not with Peter Aldgate, though he would need to be informed. It was requested with Lance Corporal William Carr. Peter Aldgate read the message twice. He sat with it for a moment. Then he walked down to the medical wing, knocked on the door of William's room, and sat down across from him with the printed message in his hand. He slid it across the small table between them and watched William's face as he read it. William read it once. Then he read it again. He set it down carefully on the table. He looked at Peter Aldgate with an expression that was difficult to read, because William's expressions were always difficult to read. But beneath the steadiness, there was something working, something processing, something that had not yet resolved into a feeling he could name. He asked, quietly, what this meant. Peter Aldgate said he was not entirely certain, but that in his experience, this kind of request meant that someone wanted to understand something that the public record had not made clear. He said that William did not have to agree to the meeting. He said it was entirely voluntary. He said that whatever William decided, it would not affect the formal inquiry process, which would continue on its own schedule. He thought about his grandfather's tie in his locker. He thought about his father sitting in his sitting room in the north of England, watching the footage on television. He thought about the 31 seconds that had become 11 seconds, that had become 60 million impressions of the worst moment of his career. He said yes. The meeting took place 6 days after the incident, in the late morning, in a room inside the palace that William had never seen and would probably never see again. He had been driven there by regimental car, wearing his service uniform, which he had pressed himself the night before, with the careful attention he gave to every uniform. He had slept, finally, a full 7 hours, which was the most sleep he had managed in more than a week, and the difference it had made to his body was considerable. He felt present in a way he had not felt in days. He was met at a side entrance by a member of the household staff, who led him through a series of corridors that smelled of old wood and something that might have been beeswax. The staff member was a quiet, efficient woman named Margaret who said very little as they walked, and seemed entirely unbothered by the strangeness of the situation, which William found calming. They arrived at a room with tall windows that looked out onto a garden. The room was furnished simply. There was a table with 2 chairs. On the table was a tray with tea and 2 cups. William stood just inside the door and waited. He had been told that the meeting would be brief. He had been told to speak honestly and simply, as himself, not as a soldier performing a role. He had nodded when this was explained to him, and he had tried to carry that instruction with him into the room. Standing by the window, with the garden beyond the glass and the tea cooling on the table, he was aware that he was not entirely sure he knew how to be himself, rather than the version of himself he had been performing for 3 years. The door opened. The monarch entered. William straightened, as his training required. He did not look directly, as his training also required. But in his peripheral vision, he registered something that surprised him. The monarch was alone. No aide, no staff member, no secretary standing at a respectful distance. Just a person, walking into a room with a table and 2 chairs and a tray of tea, for a private conversation with a 24-year-old soldier from a small town in the north of England. He was directed, gently, to sit. He sat. The tea was poured. And then, for the next 22 minutes, something happened that William would spend the rest of his life describing only to the people he trusted most. What happened in that room was not a reprimand. It was not an official proceeding. It was a conversation between 2 people, one of whom had watched a great deal of footage and read a medical report and wanted to understand something, and one of whom had never been asked to explain himself by anyone who genuinely wanted to hear the answer. William was asked, simply, what had happened. Not on the day of the procession, before it. What had happened before? He told the truth. He said he had been unwell for 4 days and had not reported it. He said he had not reported it because he was afraid of being seen as unreliable. He said that he had stood on that forecourt for almost 3 hours, in full dress uniform in August heat, without water, because he believed that was what was required of him. He said, and this was the part that cost him the most to say, because he had never said it aloud to anyone, that he had not known how to ask for help without feeling that he was failing. He stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Outside the tall windows, the garden was green and still. The response he received was not what he had expected. He had expected, in some part of himself that he had not examined too closely, to be told that he should have behaved differently, that the incident had caused embarrassment, that there were standards to be upheld. None of those things were said. What was said instead, in a tone that William described to his father later as simply straightforward, was that no uniform was worth a person's health, that the ability to ask for help was not weakness, that the assumption of the opposite was a problem worth addressing, and that it was the kind of problem that tended to be addressed more effectively when it involved a specific person and a specific incident rather than an abstract policy discussion. William sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded. He said quietly that he understood. He was thanked for his honesty. He was asked one more thing, whether, if given the opportunity to speak to younger soldiers about what had happened, he would be willing to do so, not publicly, not with cameras, not as a lesson in what not to do. Simply honestly, in the way he had just spoken. He said that he would. When William walked back out through the corridors that smelled of old wood and beeswax, he was still a soldier under formal review. None of the official machinery had changed. The inquiry was still open. His name was still trending on platforms he had chosen not to look at. His face was still on 3 national newspaper front pages if you searched in the right archive. None of that had been resolved or erased. But something had shifted in a way that was hard to name precisely. He had been seen, accurately, by someone with no reason to see him accurately, and the experience of that was not something he had words for. He sat in the regimental car on the way back to the barracks and watched the city move past the window and tried to find the right word for what he was feeling. He did not find it. He let it sit without a name, which was, for William Carr, an unusual and strangely comfortable thing to do. The formal review concluded 18 days after the incident. The outcome was noted in the regimental record and communicated to William in a brief and factual meeting with Peter Aldgate. The inquiry had found no grounds for disciplinary action. The medical record had been reviewed and accepted as the primary explanatory evidence. William was cleared to return to full duty following medical sign-off, which came 5 days later. He returned to the barracks on a Tuesday morning in early September. The weather had broken at last and the air was cool and clean. He walked through the gate with his kit bag over one shoulder and nodded to the guard on duty, who nodded back. No speech, no ceremony, just a Tuesday morning and a gate, and the ordinary day resuming. Inside the regiment, people knew what had happened. Soldiers talk, in the careful and particular way that soldiers talk, around things rather than directly at them. Nobody made a point of addressing it with William directly. But over the following days, a number of his colleagues found reasons to be in the same room as him and say small and ordinary things in a way that communicated larger things. His sergeant, a solid man named Owen, stopped him after a routine inspection to say that the boots looked sharp, which they did. But the way Owen said it, with a slight nod that meant something beyond the boots, told William that his return was not just tolerated, but welcomed. Frances visited at the weekend, as she had promised. She brought food from a place their mother used to order from when they were children, and they ate it at a table in the barracks common room and talked about everything except the procession, which was exactly what William needed. She asked him at one point how he was actually doing, using the word actually in the way she always did when she wanted a real answer instead of a performance. He told her the truth, which was that he was tired, but that he thought things were going to be all right. She nodded and handed him more food and did not push further, because Frances understood her brother well enough to know that when he said things were going to be all right, he had usually done the work of figuring out whether that was true. It was 3 weeks after William's return to duty that Peter Aldgate called the regiment together and outlined, without drama or excessive detail, a set of new protocols that would apply to all ceremonial duties going forward. The protocols included mandatory hydration checks before and during extended public duties. They included a formal process by which any soldier could report health concerns to the duty medical officer without the need to go through their direct superior first. They included a clear and documented statement that standing down from a duty on medical grounds would carry no disciplinary consequence of any kind, and that this was not a change in expectation, but a clarification of what had always been the correct position, even when the culture of the regiment had sometimes implied otherwise. Peter Aldgate delivered this information in the same measured, practical tone he used for all operational communications. He did not make a speech. He did not invoke William's name or the incident. He simply outlined the new protocols, answered 2 questions from the floor, and moved on to the next item. William sat in the 3rd row and listened. He did not react visibly, but he held the new protocols in his mind the way he held certain things that mattered, carefully and without letting them show on his face. He thought about his grandfather, George Carr, who had kept his boots polished until the day he died and had stood straight at every public occasion he had ever attended. He thought about his father, Edward Carr, who had not taken unnecessary sick days because his family needed the money. He thought about the version of himself he had been building for 3 years, the one with no visible seams, and he thought about the 22 minutes in a quiet room with tall windows and a tray of tea, and the question he had been asked, and the honest answer he had given. He understood now something that he had not understood when he was building that seamless version of himself. That showing up did not mean showing nothing. That the steadiest kind of soldier, the genuinely reliable kind, was not the one who never struggled. It was the one who told the truth about struggling so that other people could do the same. That was not weakness. That was a different kind of standing straight. The regiment received the protocols without complaint. There were a few quiet conversations in the days that followed, the kind that happen in corridors and over meals, where older soldiers noted to younger ones that things had changed, and younger ones filed the information away. No one made a point of why. But everyone understood that the why existed, that there was a reason behind the change, that it had a face and a name even if the name was not spoken. William went back to his duties. He stood at his post at the palace gates in the cool of September, and the cold of October, and the early frost of November. He stood correctly, and he stood still, and he carried the ceremonial rifle with the precision that 3 years of training had given him. He was, by every visible measure, the same soldier he had been before. But something inside the measurement had shifted, quietly and permanently. He knew where the edge was now. He knew what it felt like to reach it, and he knew, for the first time, that reaching it and saying so was not the end of something. It was, in fact, the beginning of a different and better kind of strength. The thing about change in large institutions is that it almost never announces itself. There is no ceremony for it, no marker on the calendar, no morning when someone stands at the front of a room and says, "Today we are different from how we were yesterday." Change in institutions happens the way a river changes a bank, slowly, through accumulation, through the patient pressure of water on stone, until one day you look up, and the landscape is different, and you cannot point to the exact moment it shifted. The new protocols that Peter Aldgate had outlined to the regiment in October took hold over the following months, in the specific and practical way that good policies do when they are backed by real consequences and real examples. Soldiers who had previously gritted their way through warning signs began, cautiously at first, to use the new medical reporting channels. A Lance Corporal named Gary stood down from a ceremonial duty in November with a knee problem that he had been managing quietly for 2 weeks. He did it correctly, following the new process, and nothing happened to him except that his knee was assessed and treated, and he returned to duty 8 days later, in better condition than he had been in for a month. The word spread, the way words spread in regiments, sideways and quietly, and without any kind of announcement. In the spring of the following year, a training review was conducted across the ceremonial regiments, prompted in part by the protocols that had been introduced after William's incident. The review examined, among other things, the question of how soldiers were prepared for extended ceremonial duties in variable weather conditions. The findings were not dramatic, but they were clear. There were gaps. There were assumptions built into the training that assumed a level of physical invulnerability that no human being actually possesses. There were informal cultural expectations that had accumulated over decades, and that, when examined directly, turned out to have no formal policy basis at all. They were simply the way things had always been done, which is the most powerful kind of rule, because it requires no enforcement and offers no mechanism for challenge. The review recommended changes. The changes were approved. They were implemented across multiple regiments over the following 18 months. Heat management guidelines were updated. Hydration requirements were formalized. The concept of proactive health reporting, which sounds obvious when stated plainly, but which had in practice been significantly undermined by informal cultural pressure, was embedded into the formal training curriculum for all soldiers entering ceremonial duties. William did not know the full extent of this when it was happening. He knew about the protocols in his own regiment because he had been present when they were announced. He did not know that the ripple had gone further. He was not told because there was no formal mechanism for telling him, and because the nature of institutional change is that it rarely circles back to the person at its origin. He was, by that point, simply a soldier doing his job. He had spoken to a group of younger recruits once, as he had agreed to do in the quiet room with the tall windows. It was an informal session, arranged without fanfare, in a room inside the barracks. There were 11 soldiers present, all of them in the early stages of their ceremonial training. William sat in a chair at the front of the room with no notes and no prepared remarks, and told them, as plainly as he knew how, what had happened. He did not tell them about the royal household or the private meeting. He told them about the 4 days before the procession. He told them about the choice he had made each morning to say nothing. He told them what it had cost him, and what it had revealed about the version of himself he had been trying to maintain. He told them that the uniform required strength, and that real strength included knowing when to stop. Nobody in that room asked questions afterward, not immediately. There was a brief silence of the kind that settles over a group when something true has been said. Then a young soldier in the second row named Alex, who was 19 and had been in the regiment for 4 months, raised his hand and asked what had made William finally decide to speak honestly. Not to the doctor, not to the inquiry, but in the private meeting, in the room he was not naming. William thought about it for a moment. He said, "Someone asked me the right question at the right time, and I decided that the answer I was going to give was not worth less than the real answer." Alex nodded slowly. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked back up, and something in his face suggested that he was filing that answer somewhere specific. William noticed it. He did not comment on it, but he noticed it. What William could not have known, sitting in that room, was that Alex would carry that answer into the next 2 years of his service, and that it would surface at a specific and important moment. Alex was not a boy who talked much about his feelings or his health. He had grown up in a household where getting on with things was not merely encouraged, but was simply assumed to be the default mode of operation for anyone with any self-respect. He had arrived at the regiment with the same unspoken belief that William had arrived with, that the soldier who showed no weakness was the best kind of soldier. Alex managed 2 years without needing to test that belief against a real situation. The test arrived on a morning in late summer, 2 years after the session, in the room with 11 recruits. Alex was assigned to a ceremonial duty. It was a warm day. He had been managing a rising fever since the previous evening. He stood in his room in the early morning and looked at his uniform laid out on the bed, and thought about William Carr and the question he had been asked in a quiet room and the answer William had given. He picked up his phone and sent a message to the duty medical officer through the official channel that the new protocols provided. He said he was unwell and needed to be assessed before the duty. The response came back within 12 minutes. He was assessed. He was stood down. He was treated. He returned to duty 4 days later. Nothing happened to him. The ceremony proceeded without incident. The uniform was worn by another soldier who stood correctly and held the rifle correctly and drew no attention from anyone because everything went exactly as it should go. Alex never told William what he had done. There was no occasion for it, no structure in which that conversation would naturally have occurred. But 2 years later, at a regimental dinner, he sat 3 seats away from William and refilled his water glass for him without being asked, which is a small thing that means nothing to an observer, and everything to someone who understands the texture of how soldiers communicate care. William's father, Edward Carr, followed what he could understand of the aftermath from his sitting room in the north of England. He did not understand all of it. He understood that the inquiry had been dropped. He understood that his son had returned to duty. He understood that something had changed in the regiment, though the specifics of what and how were not entirely clear to him. What he understood most clearly was a phone call from William on a Thursday evening in November, 3 months after the procession, in which his son said, without any preamble, that he thought he had been wrong about something for a long time, and that he was working on being less wrong about it. Edward sat with the phone in his hand and listened. He did not interrupt. When William had finished speaking, he said that he thought he understood what his son meant. He said that he thought he might have been wrong about the same thing for a long time. He said that it was possible they had both learned it from the same place. There was a pause on the line, not an uncomfortable one, just a pause while 2 people sat with something honest between them. Edward asked if William was eating properly. William said he was. Edward said good. William said he would visit at Christmas. Edward said he would make sure there was enough food. They talked for another few minutes about ordinary things, the kind of ordinary things that people talk about when the important things have already been said, and then they said goodbye, and that was all. Dorothy Carr, William's mother, had kept every newspaper clipping from the days following the procession, the ones with William's photograph in them, the ones that had said unkind things. She had kept them not out of bitterness but because she believed that the whole story, the full version, deserved to exist somewhere, even if only in a small folder in the back of a kitchen drawer. When the inquiry was dropped and the protocols were changed and William returned to duty, she did not add any new clippings to the folder. She simply left it where it was. She had a different record she kept instead, a text message William had sent her the day he returned from the private meeting. It read, "I'm all right, Mum. I think I actually am." She kept that on her phone for the rest of her life. Frances, who had visited and brought food from the place their mother used to order from, went on to study nursing 2 years after the incident. She had not planned to. She had been working in administration and had found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on spreadsheets. She would say, when people asked what had made her change direction, that she had sat in a barracks common room with her brother and watched him trying to be fine and understood for the first time that being fine was not the same thing as being all right, and that the difference between those 2 things was exactly the gap that a good nurse knew how to step into. She qualified 3 years later. She was very good at it. William stayed in the regiment for another 4 years. He was promoted to corporal 18 months after the incident, which was noted in the regiment as neither fast nor slow, simply the right timing for the right soldier. He trained 11 recruits of his own during those years, in formal sessions and informal conversations, and the small moments that happen around the edges of organized training, when a recruit asks a question that is really a different and more personal question underneath. He was consistent about one thing in all of those interactions. He never told a recruit that the way to survive the hardest days was to hold on until they were over. He told them that the way to survive the hardest days was to know who you were on those days, not the performed version, the real one, the one underneath the uniform, and to be honest about what that person needed. It was not a short message. It did not fit on a motivational poster, but in the rooms where he said it, with 11 recruits at a time, or with 1 recruit in a corridor, it landed. He could tell, not because people reacted visibly, because the people he was talking to were training themselves not to react visibly, but because of the particular quality of attention that a room acquires when something true is being said. He left the regiment on a clear morning in late spring. He had given his 4 years after the incident and felt that the next part of his life was somewhere else. The leaving was quiet and dignified, which was exactly how William Carr would have wanted it. There was a small dinner with the regiment, during which Owen, his sergeant, said a few words that were direct and accurate and did not attempt to be sentimental, which was the best possible gift a man like William could receive on an occasion like that. He drove north in a car he had bought the previous autumn. He had his kit bag in the boot and his grandfather's tie on the seat beside him, no longer folded in a locker, but laid flat on the seat where he could see it. He had taken it out of the locker on his first day back after the medical clearance and kept it with him since. He was not entirely sure why. He thought it had something to do with the idea that things could mean more than one thing at the same time, that his grandfather's straight back and polished boots and quiet pride had been real and worth carrying forward, and that so was the honest conversation in the quiet room with the tall windows, and that these two things were not in conflict with each other. He drove through the city and out the other side of it. The road opened up. The sky was pale blue and clear, the kind of sky that looks pleasant in photographs and feels generous when you are moving through it. Somewhere in a regiment in London, on a warm morning that had not happened yet, a soldier who had never heard the name William Carr would feel unwell before a ceremony and would think about the rule that said they could report it without consequence, and would make a phone call or send a message or knock on a door, and nothing terrible would happen, and the ceremony would go forward, and the day would be ordinary in all the best ways. William did not know this was coming. He was just driving north, toward his family, with the window open and the air moving through the car. But it was coming. It was already in motion. And it had started, like most important things do, not with a triumph, but with something falling.